Welcome, everyone. My name is Jet McLaughlin. This is Sustainable Culture. If you're wondering what that is, first off, it's episode 31. That's a weird episode to start wondering what in the world is going on here. But hey, this is a podcast about exploring the relationship between humans, society, our psyche, and the natural world. So now you know. Last time we discussed the culture around books, reading, and owning a bookstore with Alex Lopez. Her shop, named Bookishly Happy, is a charming staple here in Coeur d'Alene, and getting to address the importance of the culture surrounding that world was both eye-opening and educational. Such a fulfilling interview for me, so if you haven't already tuned in, it's episode 30. Please do and enjoy. Coming up just a short time away is our next community trash pickup, which will be on Saturday, November 10th at 11 a.m. at Tubbs Hill in downtown Coeur d'Alene. We will have free coffee from Doma Coffee and bagels from Back Pocket Bakery. And it's really just a good opportunity to take a stroll in nature while doing some good for the community. Safe Passage will also be participating, so we will have a great variety of sponsor presents. Follow the Instagram at Sustainable Culture Online for more details as we get closer to the event. Everyone is invited. It's a great way to spend some time outside on a day on the weekend with the family and to be a part of what makes this podcast what it is really about. Now, this week is a very cool one. I can hardly believe it, but I was lucky enough to speak with the Idaho Conservation League yet again. This is the second time I've gotten to do this. This time I got to chat with Adrian Gallo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I might be pronouncing that completely wrong. Adrian is the Climate Program Manager at ICL and a soil science expert. We spoke in length about groundwater, aquifers, and yes, soil. But more so, we really opened up about how fertilizer and agriculture affects those things, and really just a host of issues related to farming and regulatory issues specific to Idaho. We hinted during this conversation that we may chat further about dairy farms and a much deeper discussion, so stay tuned for that. I'd really love to have him back on the show. Just a wealth of knowledge on these topics. Speaking with Adrian was particularly encouraging to me because as a student pursuing a related career, these talks really contextualize what I'm working towards in my studies. It just kind of validates what I'm figuring out in school in real time right now. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. I hope you find it as educational as I did. So let's dive right in. This is episode 31, an interview with a soil scientist. I'm glad we got to meet up today. I'm so stoked to discuss this because I've been studying this in my other class. I'm taking 2 classes this semester, and it's water quality in the Pacific Northwest is the class. It's I love that it's specific to this area, and it's been a good time learning about not just water quality stuff at large, but also locally here. And recently, we've kind of started to move past it, but recently we talked quite extensively about aquifers and groundwater, and that trailed into surface water. And as such, we addressed agriculture and how that affects things, fertilizers and stuff like that. So it got me thinking. A long time ago, as I emailed you, I got to speak with Mitch Cutter, and a delight, an absolute delight. It was a really cool conversation. I was blown away by his knowledge on salmon and the water systems and how that is all affected and everything. So I have talked up Idaho Conservation League like since then. Like, man, you guys got to check these guys out because it was way cool to just get schooled on that and to also just see his enthusiasm towards it and to know that there's an entire organization of people like yourself who are in different specialties doing this stuff. And it's just very encouraging because when you're in school, you kind of get bogged down by the education of it all and the assignments and the crunch culture sometimes happens and you've got to get your assignments in on time. And you kind of do forget that the light at the end of the tunnel of what it is you're studying is still there. And you can kind of forget how exciting it's still going to be when you get done with what you're doing.
Yeah, no, Mitch is downstairs and, 3 offices over.
Oh, awesome.
Will Tiedemann, he's, down the hall, who wrote our wastewater treatment report. We have some big hitters and, I like to think that we punch above our weight.
Yeah.
And to your point, when you're doing, just endless amounts of dimensional analysis, you forget how you can actually use it. When you're in a position like this, you still use all the skills all the time. Just kind of didn't realize how it could be applied while you're in school. There is definitely light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, why don't we start with just kind of addressing you and who the heck you are.
Yeah.
I know you're from Idaho Conservation League, and I've already talked about you guys before, but how did you get into studying what it is you're doing as a profession now? And maybe give a little bit of a background on what it is you're actually doing currently as far as research and just the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so how did I get to this spot? I spent my previous decade of my life as a researcher. I was at Oregon State, and I am broadly an ecologist, but my real focus was on soils and soil science. I also hosted a science communication podcast where I interviewed graduate students about their research and personal stories of how they came to graduate school. And it really helped me to get out of my very narrow view of soil science and, speak to professionals and experts who do, nuclear physics, social science, economics, nanotechnology, and all the things. And through the podcast and my research, what I realized is no matter what ecosystem you're interested in trying to save, whether it's coral reefs or, black bears in the Pacific Northwest, ash trees in the Northeast, if it gets too hot, they all die. And a bunch of people that I interviewed, probably the most salient one was on cheatgrass invasion in eastern Idaho. And, she described, we can treat, a couple thousand acres at a time, but the cheatgrass wildfire invasion cycle is just so big. There's never going to be enough money. And even if there was enough money, we just don't have enough seed to reseed sagebrush steppe habitat, let alone if it's successful, and iterate that for, coral reefs and sea turtles, et cetera, that, I came to graduate school because I love the outdoors. But if I focus only on, wildlife habitat mitigation strategies, then, we won't have any wildlife left to save. So I decided to make a career transition to being more involved in the energy transition. And that's what brought me here. I'm the climate program manager at the Idaho Conservation League, and my portfolio is threefold to focus on electrifying transportation, electrifying the built environment, and, of course, to bring on renewable energy projects in the most sensible way possible to, make sure that our wildlife habitat, critical endangered species are still preserved while bringing on a bananas amount of energy that we need so that we can save the special wild wilderness places that we've protected for decades. So, that's kind of how I came here, is because I felt like a very precise environmental destruction journalist doing the podcast. And I just didn't want to publish papers yelling into the ether saying we need to do something. I decided to try and do something about it.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's what kind of, out of my own curiosity, what kind of, I guess what I'm trying to word here, being a journalist and doing your own sort of podcasting was great to hear, by the way, in your email. I'm like, oh, good. Somebody knows. What kind of things did that lead you to that you may have never saw yourself being curious about? I know with conducting my own interviews, even just in an individual interview in the middle of somebody's answer to someone's question about whatever it is, I'll have notes written that I have worked up beforehand, but
sometimes during someone's explanation of something, I'll go, oh, that's cool. Let's talk about that. And sometimes it will totally shift the conversation from what I had planned. So what kind of stuff have you have popped up just while you were doing that pops into your head that sort of may have detracted you or just interest you in a way that you never saw coming?
That's a really good question. I'm trained as a biogeochemist. I do stats, I do analytical chemistry, and like very much in the weeds. I found myself constantly pulled towards the social sciences. Constantly. Whenever I interviewed people like rural sociologists, cultural anthropologists, I found them to be the most fascinating people because, scientists are really good at running stats. We're really bad at explaining them.
It's so funny you say that because I've been, interested in environmental stuff science-wise. Before I got into an environmental science major, I was an environmental engineering major. And that I just agree with you with that. The social sciences have been pulling me in like a magnet. It is fascinating how the more I talk about sustainability and the science behind it all and the studies and everything, I'm finding the exact same thing. So I just think that's fascinating. Anyway, please continue. That's interesting.
The old idea that if people had perfect information, they would make idealized choices as if we're all rational actors. The first, the very early social science research will tell you, my goodness, we are not rational actors.
Yeah.
And by trying to obfuscate that, scientists are just not very effective. And granted, science as a profession is inherently, small c conservative. When we publish papers, we have to show to the nth degree that what we found cannot be explained by any other mechanism. So we inch our way forward. We inch our knowledge gap, forward just a little bit, teeny tiny bit. And like that, the way we're trained as academicians just makes us very conservative, very unwilling to speak passionately and with emotion.
Yeah.
And what we don't recognize is, people make decisions on emotions first.
It's true.
We publish our papers. But didn't you read that paper in the paywalled academic journal that has the answer to that really technical thing?
The one that you have to pay for a subscription for? Do you know about that one?
Literally right now, I have a paper up. Global rise in forest fire emissions linked to climate change in the exotropics. It's the kind of research that I would have done in the past, and I cannot access it because it's behind a paywall. So,
yeah. Even just doing research for my own scholarly stuff, luckily I have a lot of, the gateway of being able to log in through U of I will give you access to a lot of these things. But some of them you won't. And so I'll find seemingly the perfect title to something. Oh, that's the one. Oh, that looks like it's got the info I need. And there's a paywall there. And I'm like, man, even wanting to access it, which is funny because some people don't have any interest. I mean, let's be honest, reading through scientific peer-reviewed journals sometimes is a slog.
Oh, totally.
But it's got the info you need. So even wanting to do it is one thing, let alone getting past that paywall. Yeah. So that's crazy. I find it really fascinating that you've been drawn to the social sciences. I find it really interesting. The more I talk to professionals in the field, whatever environmental field that they're into and involved with, it isn't. So I heard this speech, and it was something on Instagram, something that came up on my feed, and it was, I believe, just putting two and two together with it, it was some kind of I wish I had more information on this, but it looked to be some kind of a leadership conference that he was speaking at, teaching people how to speak confidently. And I used to be in the retail field, and so I used to get sent to these quarterly leadership conferences all the time. So that's why I deduced that much. I'm like, this looks like something I would have had to sit through. But the guy was a fantastic speaker, and he was talking about being able to, even if you're bold-faced lying, being able to speak about something confidently and interestingly with charisma is something that a lot of scientists tend to lack sometimes. That's why when we come across these different science spokespeople in the pop culture world, we really latch on to like a few people because there's not many that really have come out. And so he was saying, he said, here is why scientists have had such a difficult time communicating climate change. And he goes, I'll show you why. I'm going to act out for you why. And he gets into character real quick and he goes, if you'll notice the curve, it's an upward curve here at the curve. And he just kind of keeps like, does
the derivative of the curve
push.
is actually increasing, indicating that the rate of change is actually increasing, a pace of which has not happened in measured time in the past. This is catastrophic.
Yeah, it's exactly that, you know. And so it's funny because when you're in school and you're studying this stuff, of course you're paying attention because you've got to take notes and you have an assignment that is going to use direct information, information directly from the speaker.
You have a captive audience.
You have a captive audience. I won't say his name for his own privacy, but my water quality professor that brought me to this idea of an interview is giving us fantastic information. He knows his stuff, but he's not an interesting presenter. Like there's no entertainment value there. There's none of that. It's I'm here because I have to be here. Because if I don't be here, I won't know the answers to, or where to look for the answers. You know, I won't understand my assignment very well. And I won't understand the content very well. So I have to be here. And to require that of the greater audience, which is most people who are not academically involved, is asking way too much.
I agree. So there's a flip side to that. There is a soil science instructor. He didn't have a PhD. He had a master's in soils, but his previous life, he was literally a rock star.
No way.
He toured the United States. If you give me a sec, I can remember his band name. But he toured the United States. Like he's very much a presenter, right?
Yeah.
And
he's performing. Presenting is his performance.
He is performing, and even though he doesn't have a PhD in the field, he's very knowledgeable, obviously. But he has converted. Like him as an individual, converted dozens of students that were in econ or environmental engineering or et cetera, random major over here.
Yeah.
And because soil science is like one of those, generic classes you can take as like an intro level class, he converted dozens of people into becoming soil scientists at the university I was at. And, because he is a good presenter.
Yeah.
Because he was a literal rock star before.
That's so cool. It really speaks to, if you're excited about something and you're good at presenting it, well, first off, if you're excited about something, you're probably just better at presenting it in the first place. But if you're excited about something to the point of being able to be really, outwardly excited and be charismatic and show people what it is that's cool about it, that you think is cool, we're really touching into what we were talking about earlier, how I was having this issue in my previous conversation with Bree there about how do we make people care about this stuff? I don't think that there's enough excitement for a lot of these things. It could be because of a myriad of reasons. I mean, it might just be because when you're involved in this work, it's a thankless job most of the time. And a lot of times too, the statistics that come out and the leadership that we have to kind of work around most of the time, it seems like, especially in a state like Idaho and a lot of times in the U.S. in general, we have a lot of obstacles that we have to overcome and kind of always play things on the bright side and be the stronger part there and be like, yeah, things are looking kind of grim, but here's some good news. What that kind of gets to you after a while, and it comes off that way. And maybe that's one of the secrets to helping people care more about these things is being excited about it. I mean, I had a math professor to share my own version of your story. I had a math professor is for calculus, integral calculus. When you talk about calculus, math, I was a math tutor for a long time. People hate it. Everybody hates it. They're just, no. I hate it. Please stop talking about math. I already have trauma about this, and it's very funny to me. I really enjoy math. And so I got into math tutoring because it was, I have found math easier than science to latch on to in a couple of different ways. There's probably a lot of reasons for that, but it was like a game to me. It was like a puzzle to me. It was like there was a reward to figuring out the right answer. And the patterns that you learn in math sometimes, I really latched onto and I really got excited about. I had this professor for integral calculus, and he was kind of like what you were saying. I don't know if he was a rock star or anything, but he had the funniest sense of humor of any professor I've ever had. He was somewhere between like a Jim Carrey and maybe a couple of comedians that I know. And he's fantastic, super funny, really dry slapstick sense of humor, young guy. And simultaneously, beyond just being funny and presentable and entertaining, he had a way of, he knew his content so thoroughly that if you were to ask him, because when you get to calculus, you start to ask questions about different ways to solve the same problem, as opposed to just one linear path there. And we had this sort of cohort because it was a summer condensed class, and people are already like, oh God.
Yeah, it's 4 weeks for a 10-week class kind of thing.
Pretty much. It was nuts. 5 days a week, always in class, doing homework every day. And calculus homework is like many hours. And doing it with a group is a huge help. So we were kind of this small class because it was a summer course. And the people, when you're in Calculus 2, it's no longer the people that have to be there. You do have to be there to get the degree you want. But now it's people who are really pushing past the whole chore behind it. And it's like, I'm here because I'm going to probably be using this information for the job I'm going to be doing. So there's an extra passion behind it. So combination with that and this funny guy, we would ask him questions like, well, why can't we do it this way? I thought that you were saying, this strategy works for such and such. And he'd say, well, he'd think about it for a second after having shown us the one way to do it. And he'd go, you can, but you might run into issues. I'll explain why. Then he would write out the whole other way to do it and show us, and it'd circle where we might get lost. And goes, the only problem is you're going to have an issue right here. You might confuse this, and the other thing. And he goes, what you could also do, and then he'd show us like a third way. He knew this stuff so thoroughly. And this guy would give speeches, intellectual, like TED Talk-esque speeches on the difference between zero and undefined. And just like mind-blowing stuff like that. So this guy was a rarity for sure, and I acknowledge that. But
especially for math.
Especially for math, because in math it's very much like, it's very rigid and it's sometimes just unfriendly and just really tough to get through. I wish more people in the education sector were like him and like the rock star guy that you had mentioned, because I really do think that these conversations would just look a lot different.
Yeah, that's where like academic training forces you to be dispassionate, because we are perfectly objectable beings and we should strive to be that. And, the necessary outflow of being objective means having no emotion, because emotion taints the mind. And that is just so hammered into you, like when you get a PhD. And like, it's truly unfortunate that like the smartest people are just the worst communicators because they've, been forced that, part of their brain out of their psyche for the intention of being perfectly, objective, when any social scientist will tell you no one's truly objective.
Let me switch us, because I am a good rambler. I will ramble about anything for a long time. So I'm going to cut myself off, and I want to ask you about, I got really interested in the concept of how aquifers and groundwater is affected specifically by agriculture. And in Idaho, we have a ton of agriculture. There's agriculture all over the U.S. Well, not all over, but in lots of the U.S. But in Idaho specifically, we have quite a bit, as you're well familiar with. And I would love to hear from you. You don't have to get, I mean, you can get as nitty gritty with this as you want. You have worked with this stuff professionally. And so I'm learning this concept in class, but I would love to hear a real world just rundown from you as macro or micro or whatever, about, we need farming, obviously. We need food, and we need other things that come from farming, but we are running into these really interesting problems with fertilizer over nutrienting the soil, and as such, it for those of you, and you can explain this much better than me, but you have fertilizer and other things that we use on the soil, cow manure being one of those things even. So you have both organic and synthetic fertilizers that are often used, and they seep down through the soil, and they can affect the aquifers, and they can therefore affects water quality, potentially public safety and things. And so I would love to hear information about that you guys have run into, that you specifically have run into, regarding this interesting dance between, we need fertilizer, sure, but you also have to work with where it's safe and where it's unsafe. So, yeah, what have you been doing in your professional field regarding this, and what kind of obstacles have you been running into in terms of just having to work through these challenges?
Yeah, I'll start with my specific area of expertise, and I'll expand out to water more broadly. My specific area of expertise is soil nutrition, and I took, a year of irrigation management classes, another year of fertilizer management classes, and the thing that we've known since the 70s is, for all the nitrogen application that we give plants, 15-20% of it actually gets taken up by the plants. The rest of it gets lost to microbes or, drops out the bottom and into groundwater. So for all the nitrogen, phosphorus that we add, most of it the plant doesn't really get. And that hasn't appreciably changed in, modern agricultural times since the invention of the plow. The form of fertilizer has changed, right? Instead of manure application, now we're doing slow release, synthetically lined fertilizer. So, instead of, 3-4 applications, you can only do one. But, we're still producing a whole bunch of nitrogen fertilizer. And on the climate side, we produce nitrogen fertilizer still from the Haber-Bosch process. It was invented during World War I when we were, trying to build more bombs. And splitting. So our atmosphere is like 70-some% nitrogen, but it's nitrogen N2. And it's a very strong triple bond, a nitrogen triple bond. And there's a limited amount of it in the air, basically, but it takes a lot of energy to break that triple bond. So there's an immense amount of emissions that come from the production and manufacturing of nitrogen-based fertilizers because it takes a lot of energy to break that triple bond. So that's on the front end. On the soil application end of things, we have noticed, and it's become more and more prominent of an issue, that as we apply more manure, but also synthetic fertilizers that especially nitrogen-based ones, they slowly acidify the soil, just slowly, just the way the chemistry works. Mm-hmm. And, if you apply it for 5-6 years, you're not really going to change your soil pH too much. But you apply it for 20, 25, 50 years, your soil pH starts changing drastically. And there are 18 essential plant nutrients that are absolutely needed and critical for plants to live and reproduce. And the availability of those 18 nutrients shifts depending on what the soil pH is. So a slightly acidic soil will be really beneficial for some elements. A slightly basic soil pH will be more beneficial for others. And there's this really good sweet spot in like the 6.5-ish pH range, slightly acidic, neutral is 7 pH. And, that 6.5, 6 is a really good spot to be because basically all of the elemental availability for those plant essential nutrients overlap. But as you get into the 5.5, 6 range, all of a sudden, a bunch of nutrients are no longer plant available. So you're giving these plants nitrogen, it's acidifying the soil, and over time, it pushes other nutrients out of balance. So then you need to add other additives, calcium carbonate typically, to return your soil to a more basic condition. Then you introduce some other issues of, increasing too many salts in your soil, so then you need to irrigate more to get rid of the salt. So you're playing this dance of like, you add more nitrogen, you acidify your soil. To undo the acidification, you add some other thing. To undo the outflow of that other thing, you need to irrigate more to wash out the salt. And it's just,
you continue to add more to undo, to add more to undo, to add more to undo.
So that's on the soil side of things, right? Really complicated. There's reasons why people get, entire academic degrees in plant nutrition, because it's pretty complicated.
Yeah.
To your water question, across the West, and when I say the West, I mean the arid West, from the Colorado River and westward. Okay. Across the West, most of the states use the overwhelming majority of their water for agriculture. For Idaho, 86% of all water withdrawn, groundwater and surface water, is used for agriculture. If you include aquaculture in there, it's 97% of all the water withdrawals in Idaho go towards agriculture and aquaculture. Idaho is top 4 in the nation for the amount of water withdrawn, the total amount of water used for agriculture, and the amount of energy used to move that water. So water and agriculture and energy are intimately linked together, something that Dr. Karen Humes talks about a lot.
Yeah, she does.
So staying with water, the prior appropriation doctrine from the 1800s is basically what gave rise to the, ability for us to farm and the allocation of water resources when this is, manifest destiny era. We thought, natural resources were, for us because it was God-given and we must use them. At that time, water in a river that ran off the farm was thought of as wasted water. Conservation measures were, let's capture that water, use it for agriculture, so that way the water's not wasted. Yeah. Right? Water in the river that, flowed downstream was thought of as wasted water. Today, our version of conservation is a little bit different, but, conservation back in the day was like, don't waste water on those dumb streams. Let's use it for agricultural production. Yeah.
Let's put it right back.
Yeah. That prior appropriation doctrine basically gave, those who came earliest the, first in line. So you can use more or less an unlimited amount of water, and as long as your water rights are satisfied, then the next person in line gets to use them. You fast forward to today, and that creates some really unfortunate consequences where the oldest landowners or water rights holders get kind of an unlimited amount of water, and those young farmers, new farmers who are coming into the industry, they are furthest down on the order of operations there. And when there are droughts, they are the first ones who get their water shut off because the folks who came here first get to use more and less than an unlimited amount of water. Yeah. So that regulatory environment continues to create many, many issues. One of them being the Colorado River Basin. If you've been following it for the last, 5-10 years, there's been lots of good reporting on there where for too long we have had too little water promised to too many people. The initial allocation of water resources 3-4 decades ago happened to be at a time when we were in a wet phase. So when, the United States Geological Survey attempted to map out how much water was in the Colorado River Basin, they said, there's 100 units of water here. I'm just using generic numbers. There's 100 units of water because in the last, 5 years that we've been measuring things, there's about 100 units of water. So we're going to allocate those 100 units of water to, all the water users who are in the basin. Turns out that was a wet period, 1. So it was kind of a high number. Yeah. And 2, they overestimated how much water was actually there.
A little optimistic. Yeah.
And then 3, there were many more water users who, instead of raising, corn, they started raising alfalfa. And that's a much more water intensive crop. Yeah. So the combination of those 3 things, having a wet period when the averages were decided, overestimating how much water was actually there, and then a change in agricultural production practices that demanded much, much more water. And then a 4th one, the population increased, obviously, increasing water demand. But the Colorado River Basin is now at a point where there's not enough water. Everyone's fighting over it. And now there are states that are paying farmers not to irrigate their fields because it is simply more economical to pay farmers to lay their fields fallow than it is to create a desalination plant now. So it's, Colorado River Basin is at that issue stage right now. Idaho, southwestern, southeastern Idaho in particular, we're not at that stage yet, right? The very early phases of, there's the first water calls, meaning there's not enough water, so we're going to shut off some water users. Yeah. The first water call, kind of happened this year. It ended up being put off, but we're at very early stages of recognizing that in Idaho, there is too little water promised to too many people. And it's just a matter of time before there's a Colorado River Basin adjudication issue in Idaho.
Do you happen to know how that's affected in, say, like in Pullman and like the Coeur d'Alene tribe and things like that? Do you happen to know how they're affected by that? Or if it's any different than the rest of the state? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that northern part of Idaho, because they're on a totally different river basin.
Yeah.
There's not nearly as many water users. It's a lot more dryland agriculture. My knowledge of how their water systems are affected is not nearly as good as what's happening in southern Idaho, where it's just much more regulated and well known because everyone's irrigating groundwater, surface water. So everyone's pulling from the aquifer. Whereas, up there's just much more, look at the clouds and wait for rain.
Yeah. That's one thing we ran into, I know, in this class was looking at, specifically with the aquifers, there's a lot more to look at and choose from, it seems like, down where you're at in the southern area there, because you have, here we looked at the differences, for example, between like over in like the Yakima area. To make a long, we won't really address that, but it looks pretty worrying, I'll just say, versus closer here where we have the Rathdrum Prairie aquifer. And remind me again, what are some of the major aquifers in your area?
Yeah, we have the Eastern Snake Plain aquifer, and it is, from a hydrogeology standpoint, absolutely fascinating. Just fascinating. It's highly permeable lava rock. The way the basin is shaped, we're getting just boatloads of water from, the central Idaho mountains, but also the Tetons, and, the Wyoming-Idaho border on the east side is, the headwaters of the Snake and eventually the Columbia. And the way the lava rock kind of created the aquifer meant that there's various Snake River recharge points. So like the Thousand Springs area, the way that water is allocated is that most of the water is accounted for from when you get to the Wyoming border to Thousand Springs. And then at Thousand Springs, the aquifer basically comes back up from the depths and recharges the Snake River. So from a regulatory standpoint, it looks like, when you look at just the nitrate and phosphorus data, it looks like water gets slightly contaminated as it's going across your Goodings, your Jeromes that have a whole bunch of dairies. And then at Thousand Springs, water gets magically clean again.
Yeah, it appears sustainable the way you're describing that at a macro view.
And, it has been extremely difficult to decidedly point the finger from a scientific perspective of, cause and effect, to point the finger at dairies as like, hey, man, you're causing all these, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution issues, because as it gets more and more polluted, it magically gets cleaner again because it's really just getting diluted from deep aquifer. And like at Thousand Springs, that water is like, I need to find the reference, but I think it's like 500 or 5,000 years old water. Just like the way aquifers work, it's kind of like a piston, and it takes a while for that water to move through the system, that by the time it, pops out the other side, that's ancient freaking water, and like we have been pretending, and this is not just Idaho, right? This is like across the arid West. We have been pretending like all the water that we're pulling today is sustainable, when in reality, we've been withdrawing much more water than what is being recharged on an annual basis.
Gosh. So let's zoom out from this a bit, because I want to make this as accessible to folks who are not in touch with this as possible. When we talk about aquifer water and the access to it, Who has access to aquifer water? Is it just people with wells? Is it people otherwise? What do you see in, at least let's keep it to Southern Idaho, just to use this as sort of a case study. What kind of, like, how many people have access to that? Who uses that exactly?
Yeah, how many people have access, it's hard to say. But who has access generally are, I will broadly use the term irrigators because they irrigate. You typically are a landholder. Like I said before, the overwhelming majority of water in Idaho is used for agriculture. Domestic wells are 1 to 2% of all water withdrawn, and that will vary depending on what county you're in, because like in Bonner County, there's no like land use code regulation. So if you want to drill a well, then like if you got money for it, send it, dude.
Yeah.
No one's gonna ask questions.
Hey, old man, drill on down, shoot.
But if you're like Jerome County, the Gooding area, there are some more land use regulations, but like you have to get a permit from the county so that if you do have a property and you want to sink a well, you got to get a thumbs up from the county commissioners, and they will always give you a thumbs up. But it's pretty much exclusively, like from a total volumetric standpoint, it is irrigators, farmers who are able to use that water because it takes a lot of money to drill a well. From an energy perspective, these irrigators have like $500,000 energy bills because it takes a lot of energy to move water 200, 300 feet vertically and then pressurize the center pivot and then push that out onto your alfalfa field. Like just the energy burden required is so high that, your average Joe Schmo isn't going to drill a 150-foot well to get water because it's expensive.
Now, I was thinking too about, I'm sorry to jump around here. I was thinking as well, especially since you're so familiar with soil science and everything. I read a study. There was a study done on how earthworms and their tunnels can actually affect the leaching process of the nutrients running through, not to mention the moisture that's absorbed. Do you have any information on that? I'm just out of nowhere. I was just kind of curious about that. The study essentially said that it does make a difference. It makes the soil a lot more porous, and then the edges of those little tunnels that they create have certain nutrients that help with the whole process. And I'm forgetting some of the more technical stuff in it, but I found it absolutely fascinating how noticeably earthworms and just their little ecosystems that they create down underneath us affect nutrient absorption and water absorption.
Mm-hmm. And since nutrients go with water, if you increase what earthworms create are called macropores, macro meaning large.
That's
when you
it.
increase a soil's macroporosity, nitrogen especially moves with water. So if you have water leaving that soil rooting zone or the plant rooting zone, then you also have nitrogen leaving that plant rooting zone as well. There are some fascinating papers from, I believe it's Minnesota. They have an earthworm invasion front. Like, I think if you type in like Upper Great Lakes earthworm invasion front or something, you'll come up with this, because there's literally, most of the earthworms are actually native to Europe. They're not North American earthworms, but there is a literal invasion front as it's marching across the upper Midwest of earthworms. And the way they can tell is these are typically deciduous forests. And in deciduous forests, you typically have, inch or 3 inch litter layer, sticks, leaves, twigs, needles, yada, yada. And the earthworms will come up, chew some of that leaf and take it down. And they will mix it so that on the back end of the invasion front, you have soil that has a much higher carbon content because all of that leaf material has been incorporated into the upper, levels of the soil. There's much more porosity because the way that earthworms chew on stuff, they leave behind little enzymes. They leave behind little like polysaccharides, like little sugars that help to clump soils in really good ways, so that if you do have like, let's say, a flood, then you won't lose nearly as much soil because the soil particles are like holding on to each other pretty well. It creates a greater degree of available soil water holding capacity so that plants can actually access that water. It's really unique as what's happening. However, the benefits and those kinds of things are much more restricted to soils that have a high clay content.
Okay.
When you have soils with high clay, it does limit how quickly water moves down the soil profile. So it's much, much slower because clay particles are really, really tiny. So water has to plinko left, right, up, down, sideways, much more than if you have sand particles. And in Idaho, southern Idaho, we have really sandy soils. So, water just shoots right through anyways.
Yeah.
So it's the effect that earthworms have in Idaho is much more minimal because water just shoots through anyways, because we don't really have any clay in our soil. That's
so interesting to me. I think that's fascinating because I did a little episode on worms and specific like earthworms and stuff a while back with a friend of mine, Jeremiah, who's a farmer, and he happens to be an expert worm farmer as well. He teaches people how to have their own little worm farms and how they impact the soil. And I was delighted to see. First off, I just love the fact that these little guys that we just don't think much about, aside from fishing bait or something, are so instrumental in the health of what we're standing on top of. And talk about taking something for granted. I mean, it's the ground. So I love that you have information on that. I would love to read more about that at some point. I think it's great that, I don't know, do you see that as being any sort of solution to some of the problems that you tend to see, like with this whole sandy soil thing? I mean, I don't know. It seems like a bigger issue than just the worms, of course, but do you see that as significant enough of an impact to use as like a realistic application to any of these issues?
This is a good segue to talk about, I don't know if you've heard about soil health practices or like climate smart agriculture.
A little bit, just dabbling, yeah.
So that's where some of my academic research would have been applied. I did a lot of soil carbon work. How do you increase soil carbon? What are the benefits that accrue? And what can farmers do differently to actually do that? And could it have climatically beneficial impacts? For an individual farm, and again, like I want to emphasize, each farm, even if you're on the same hillside, has unique challenges. Just because if you're, at 600 feet elevation on that hillside, you have soil that have, slightly more sandy material. If you're 300 feet on that same hillside, you happen to have a lot more silt, and that silt has, way more phosphorus and nitrogen than your neighbor, slightly uphill. So like even on the same hill, the practices and recommendations that could help are hyper localized and specialized, which really gives soil scientists a lot of job security. But to your direct question, generally speaking, worms and their beneficial impacts for increasing soil porosity, increasing soil carbon content, expanding how much water plants can use even when it's more dry, all of those things can be beneficial at the individual farmer level. However, great caution should be applied when saying worms can help everybody, or minimizing tillage can help everybody, or cover crops can help everybody. Because like, use cover crops as an example. The idea behind soil health is, you do some slightly different practices over time that on an individual year you won't see benefits, but over time, as you increase carbon in soils, they increase your nutrient holding capacity, they increase water holding capacity. In droughts, you will be more resilient. You won't have to use as much fertilizer. There's many, many positive benefits. They take 5-6 years for them to really respond at the, field level, plot level. And during that time, farmers are doing something different on their field than they have ever done. And it looks like no benefits are accruing. For cover crops, it is really hard to do cover crops in Idaho because our growing season is so short that if you do cover crops for, 2-3 months, that is eating into the bottom line of some farmers, and they are losing revenue. And if you're asking farmers to lose revenue, 10, 15, 20% when their margins are already incredibly thin.
Real thin, yeah.
Yeah, and you tell them, hey, in 5 years, when we have a major drought, you're going to see 10, 15% yield losses, but your neighbor who wasn't doing that is going to see 60, 70% yield losses. You're going to benefit from this sometime in the future. It's just really hard to sell that and to message that. And I feel for farmers who are in a really tight economic environment where they don't have 5 years to bet on this. But when farmers do, they do see serious benefits. And the best messaging and marketing for doing soil health is not really anything that, the Natural Resource Conservation Service can do, or not anything the public can do, but it's what their neighbor's doing. And when their neighbors see that their yield is increasing, or their neighbors see that, like, oh, hey man, you don't have like very much runoff, or like you're not using as much fertilizer this year, or like you don't have as many, weeds, yada yada. Like, the trusted neighbor syndrome is real, and that is happening very slowly. I wish it could happen faster, but farmers have to trust that the benefits are real, and they need to see their neighbor doing it first, as opposed to, their extension specialist from the university saying this is going to help you, because they're operating on really thin margins already.
So, I mean, that's a great talk about a segue, because I had wanted to ask you, we know that there are issues with, speaking of the fertilizer use and all of these different challenges, especially with razor thin margins being what they are. What is a farmer to do with these types of issues? I'm sure you get that raised up in very real contexts, involved with the work you do. What do those conversations look like?
Yeah. This is where I've been frustrated by my academic colleagues not recognizing that what the cultural imprinting has on farmers and growers, and why it is so difficult for people to change what they do. And just as an example, like I'm right-handed. I brush my teeth in the morning with my right hand. If you want to see how difficult it is to change what is seemingly a simple practice, brush your teeth with your left hand. See how many times you stab yourself in the mouth. See how difficult it is for it to become regular. And that is just the teeniest window into trying to convince farmers to do something different that their great-grandpappy did, their grandpappy did, their pappy did, and that they're doing.
I don't know if you've ever tried to write with your left hand, but I write everything backward, like mirrored. I write the letters backwards and everything. So if I were to try, with that metaphor, if I were to try that different of a solution, it would be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah. So, we are, and I say we, putting on my, previous agricultural scientist hat on, we are asking farmers to do something different. Whether that is, switching from flood irrigation to center pivot sprinkler irrigation, whether that's going from, tilling 2-3 times a year to tilling, every other year, or maybe only once a year, to reducing their nitrogen input, to decreasing their herbicide treatments, just to use fertilizer as an example here. If you are a farmer and you enroll in the crop insurance program, these are typically only allowed for major commodities, your wheat, your corn, alfalfa. They are typically not allowed for, asparagus, tomatoes, limes, berries, for various reasons, but that's just the way it is. If you enroll in some of these federal crop insurance programs, you are also required to apply a certain amount of nitrogen per hectare per year. The rationale behind that is, if the federal government is going to back you in bad times, they need to make sure that you're not sabotaging your farm to just get the payout. And that's exceedingly rare anyways, but that's just the way the system is designed. And, it hasn't appreciably changed since the 90s, where we're asking farmers to apply 200 pounds of nitrogen per hectare per year. And we know that that's a severe over application of nitrogen, but farmers can't try something different because they risk losing their crop insurance, which is it's their backstop. And talk about trying to convince farmers and growers to, not have that backstop in case of bad times, which are coming, to try something different.
Not to mention, I'm sure there's this tension in this relationship with because I know farmers in my family, and there's a lot of they're up in Maine is where most of my family's from, so completely different as far as the topic of the climate and everything. However, it's just interesting how there's always this weird relationship between regulatory stuff and old-fashioned know-how. How dare some body tell me what to do when I've been doing it, like you said, the way my grandpappy did it for eons, and they did it the way their grandpappy did it since we got here off the boat, and it's interesting when you're trying to regulate this stuff, but the regulatory body might not know this information. They might be academically inclined. They might be inclined as far as systemic stuff, but they're not necessarily farmers themselves. So it's interesting how you have this. It seems like there's a lot of resistance.
Yeah, there is a lot of resistance, and this is where I'm going to inject a sprinkle of hope here. Soil health practices have been tried to be pushed by extension, university extension services for decades now. It really started during or post Dust Bowl, right? This is when the Soil Conservation Service was created.
Yeah.
They advocated for things like minimal tillage, windrows, cover crops, and what we're advocating for today through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which changed its name from the Soil Conservation Service. We're advocating for minimal tillage, windrows, cover crops. Like, we're advocating for quite literally the same thing.
Same stuff.
Literally the same stuff, right? But like, these practices do work, but it does require an upfront financial investment and a change in practices, which is cultural. There's a financial piece, and then there's a cultural piece. And in the last 5-6 years, there's been much more federal funding for soil health practices, and the uptake rates have been much higher because farmers are more and more farmers are willing to change, and whether that's something like 80% of farmland in the next 20 years is going to change hands because farmers are aging out of they want to retire. So there's a new crop of farmers who are willing to try something different. That willingness is coinciding with much more federal dollars available to try something different, to be an additional backstop they didn't have before. And, extension agents are becoming a little bit more savvy about, what to do. That this is all coinciding that the uptake of these agricultural conservation practices really are finding a foothold. And that is pretty good. It's not as fast as I would like it to be. But again, trust in your neighbor of what your neighbor is doing is just the best marketing strategy. And there are many more neighbors starting to do this stuff.
That's good news. I mean, there's something there. I mean, it is interesting. I think about that a lot because I have a lot of family who, just as a rule, I think is a generational thing. I think it's a healthy amount, but sometimes it can be debilitating to progress where there's a distrust for governmental type stuff. And I think sometimes that's healthy, but at the same time, just not productive at the same, it really depends on the issue and what we're talking about. I'm one of those people that's an unaffiliated voter, for example, and it's because of the time, and I don't mean to make this political, but it's more just to state that I do think, especially with something like agricultural stuff and farming, it's important to be able to be as unbiased as possible, going, okay, well, why does the regulation exist? Why is this conversation even a thing? Is there something in my practices that is affecting the overall ecosystem? And it takes a certain unbiased opinion or status, I suppose, to be able to have that conversation with yourself and perhaps your neighbors and figure that out.
If I can use it as a segue to talk about something that we haven't mentioned yet.
Please
that
do.
Is, the elephant in the room. Maybe I should say the cow in the room.
The cow burps in the room. Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
yeah. The cow burps and the cow poop.
I had to mention that.
Yeah. You surprise me how much of a problem pollution is from fertilizer, synthetic and otherwise, but just the cows themselves. So like cows produce on an annual basis compared to a human 45 times more phosphorus pollution and 34 more times more nitrogen pollution than people. And there are 2.5 million cows in the state, and there's less than 2 million people. We have very strict regulations for wastewater treatment plants because when you have cities, you can't just discharge our poop into the rivers. You got to clean that poop.
Yep.
Dairies don't have that level of strict regulation, even though they produce the equivalent of 16 million people worth of pollution just in the Magic Valley. You know, so like for all this hubbub of like, oh, population's increasing like crazy. What are we going to do about it? You know, I'm like, yeah, the dairy cow population has been increasing like crazy. And like, that's really what's polluting our rivers and streams.
I'm so glad you mentioned this because I was completely getting distracted by these other things. This is a huge issue. And for those of you who are listening who don't or aren't paying attention to this, it's definitely something a quick Google search will show you. It's fascinating and disturbing just how pollutive dairy farms are. Not to mention the meat industry. We hear about the meat industry a lot. I think it gets a lot of press, negative press, documentaries. They're everywhere. But the dairy farms, absolutely. I'm just supporting what you're saying.
Yeah, so I'm just in other ag-dominated regions, artificial fertilizers and manure account for 90% of the nitrogen inputs to our groundwater systems. So like when we think of, you know, who are the biggest polluters, you know, like if you're in Utah, you know, like the coal plants are the biggest polluters. They're like releasing, you know, mercury up the Yuha.
Oh yeah.
But in Idaho, you know, we don't have coal plants. We outlawed that in the 80s thanks to the Idaho Conservation League way back in the day. But what we do have are a boatload of dairies, and they are highly polluting in a inventive twist of, you know, soil health and, you know, climate smart practices. One thing that we have, and I say we, meaning like agricultural community writ large, we have tried to do is find a solution to the manure problem because manure has some value, right? It has some nitrogen, it has some phosphorus, it has some magnesium. All of those are plant essential nutrients. It has some value that you can potentially reapply it onto fields, but it is simply not valuable enough to transport it to the places that need it. And again, the dairy industry, the meat industry more broadly, has tried some really unique ways to create what is essentially a waste product into a financial product. And one way they've done that is with dairy digesters. The idea being that you collect all the manure into a holding pond. Those holding ponds leak a lot, and they leak into the groundwater a lot. All right, we'll put that to the side because you know, agriculture has more or less an exemption from the Clean Water Act, so they're not regulated the same way that cities and people are. Off to the side, okay. So let's put all this manure into a big holding pond. Let's put a cover over it so we can capture the methane and CO2 that's emitted, and let's convert that into biogas. Let's convert that and let's stick it in our pipeline so that way we can use it. And then the effluent, the back end of that manure digestion process, the effluent has a bunch of nitrogen, a bunch of phosphorus, and we can apply that to fields, right? Okay. On the gas, it is absolutely wild to me, but I wish more people knew. California taxpayers are paying for the development and construction of dairy digesters in Idaho because California has a renewable fuel standard, a requirement that requires them to offset their emissions that they cannot, you know, reduce by electric vehicles or yada yada.
Whoa.
And one of the most effective ways for California's renewable fuel standard to be offset is by buying methane emissions that are captured in other states. And it just so happens that, you know, Texas, California, and Idaho are some of the largest dairy producers in the country, and Idaho is a state for, you know, a business-friendly environment.
Sure.
Which means limited regulation.
Oh, yeah.
But dairies are getting more money from the methane credits that they are capturing than from the dairy that they are selling. And that is
That's insane.
Yeah, and that just started happening the last 3 or 4 years because the way the California Air Resources Board, the way that they did some of their kind of like emissions reductions in their math, it came out that like, oh yeah, if you capture methane from dairies, that is like the most bang for your buck in emissions reductions. Yeah, you know, and Shell, you know, the oil conglomerate, they're also trying to find some emissions reductions. So they're also funding these dairy digesters to count as offset, right? So that's the gas side. The effluent side, again, because dairies to have some level of regulation, but not nearly as strict or as stringent as would be necessary. When you try to apply all this effluent onto fields, you acidify the soil. You have too much nitrogen and phosphorus for what the plants actually need. The amount of manure produced doesn't necessarily come at a time of year when, in Idaho, it is real cold and frozen for many months of the year, but we're still producing a lot of manure, right? Like, what do you do with that? Like, it is a problem where there is simply too much pollution with just a sprinkle of, maybe we can apply it to field, or maybe we can sell this as, renewable fuel credits. But like, the scale of the pollution problem is simply too massive for the soils to absorb and for our atmosphere to hold. So this is what, if listeners don't know, this is a classic case of greenwashing.
I was just going to say that. I was like, it sounds like a classic greenwashing case, because I'm sure by the capture of all those gases and the reusing of it, not being in a good way, but they're still like, look, we're reusing stuff. Like, that looks and seems good, right? That's conservation, right?
It looks and seems good, but now there are more dairies coming to the state paid for by California taxpayers, and we Idahoans are getting the river pollution from the cows while California gets the renewable fuel credits on their balance sheet, and like, for all the talk of, the Californication of Idaho, like, no one wants to talk about, us bringing in more pollution into the Snake River so that in the summer there's, a month or two of the year when there's algal outbreaks and, dogs die and people get sick because of all the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution coming from mostly of the dairies.
That's crazy. I had no idea the connection. I mean, that really brings a whole other element to, or layer, I guess, to looking at the recent influx of Californians coming into Idaho as residents. I'm sure that a lot of them aren't even knowledgeable of this or aware of this, but the fact that those taxpayer dollars are going towards this is nuts to me.
Yeah, it's bananas. There are many California dairy operators who, because the state of California started, putting some stronger teeth on their water regulations, it made operating dairies more costly. But what states have a business-friendly environment? Idaho, Texas.
Come on in.
Yeah.
Come on in.
And
you need a tax break? Gotcha.
Compared to California, land is cheap in Idaho. So you have, your California dairy operators coming to California, getting California taxpayer dollars to build dairies that then produce pollution into the Snake River. It's too bad, but that's kind of the way things are operating. And again, this has only been a more recent development in the last 5-ish years or so, where like those renewable fuel standards were tweaked. And, I'm personally hoping they tweak those back, because there's some bad math happening there.
Seriously. It seems like, intentionally kind of skewed to look a certain way. Is that fair to say?
I would say the California Air Resources Board, who did that kind of funny math, they did the math when they think about their emissions box this big, like only in the California context, where like they're trying to capture any emissions reductions that they can. And on paper, dairy digesters do reduce emissions, but it's kind of like reducing emissions from coal-fired power plants to methane gas-fired power plants. Are you reducing emissions? Okay, yeah, technically. But if you close down one coal plant and open up 5 more, methane gas plants, are you really reducing emissions? No. So long as the dairy industry keeps getting bigger and meat demand keeps increasing, like there's no amount of dairy digesters that can actually capture the methane. And for people wondering like how much methane can you actually capture from like from the actual dairy operations, we're talking like 10-15% of the total methane emissions that are captured with these methane holding tanks. So like, are you capturing some emissions? Yes. Is it a rounding error? No. Yeah. But if we're just adding more cows, then for all the emissions that we're capturing, it's just washed out by how many more cows we're putting in.
Yeah, I was just going to say it seems like a wash. Mm-hmm. Jeez, I'm glad you addressed this, because I didn't even, I knew cows were part of this conversation, of course, being as far as like the fertilizing and they're just their manure alone, but I never dreamed of the dairy industry situation. It's an industrial issue. And this kind of goes back to, we'll wrap this up in a big fat circle where we're talking about how this brings you back to the social element so often. This being just being a dairy farmer, I can't imagine being a dairy farmer, I guess. I can't imagine. I'm sure you're confronted with this knowledge, but by getting such an influx of revenue from these breaks that you had mentioned, that's just wild to me. I mean, it brings... I was in the grocery industry for a while, and you always in the grocery industry, you hear about the paper thin margins that dairy farmers get and how it's hard to stay making money as a dairy farmer. Just breaking even is tough, especially smaller. But
especially small, yeah. The smaller operators are operating on much thinner margins than the larger operators who have the capital to build these dairy digesters, who now, again, they're making more money off the captured, well, air quotes, captured emissions than they are the dairy. So, like, they no longer have the thin margins. Being bigger in the dairy industry is now really lucrative when, like, for the small operators, it's tough.
Well, we got to talk more. We got to talk some other, like, this is great. I'm loving, we'll have to do a whole episode on dairy farming. I mean, that'd be amazing.
And, if we do a whole episode on dairy farming, we should have Will Tiedemann, our regulatory lead, because he's the one that knows the numbers back and front.
Oh,
right?
I would
He's the
love
one that
that.
helped write their wastewater treatment report. Because, like, again, for all the hubbub of, don't Californicate Idaho, no one talks about the darn, pollution that we're getting. And I wish people just realize, if you want clean water, we got to do something about the dairies.
Yeah. Oh, no, definitely. Definitely. Because you mentioned the water pools, the wastewater pools, and how those are awful and pollutive. Learned a little bit about those and how just awful those little pools are, and how they go into the water systems, they go into the soil. To even address that, we would need some more time, certainly. Mm-hmm. Why don't we just leave people on a cliffhanger in that way then? And I just want to say in finishing out here, Adrian, you've been incredible, so generous with your time. I appreciate this so much, and I would love to help listeners figure out how to find your work, how to find Idaho Conservation League. Where do we find you?
Yeah, so you can find all of our work at idahoconservation.org. I reference a lot of numbers from our wastewater treatment report that was released earlier this year, as well as our groundwater report that was released in 2021. So if you can search the 2021 groundwater report, Groundwater the Magic Valley, and the most recent wastewater treatment report of 7th Annual Idaho Conservation League Wastewater Treatment Plant Report.
Awesome. What's next for you professionally here? What are you getting into?
Oh boy. So again, like I said, my day-to-day work is now a lot to do with bringing on renewable energy projects in the most consistent way possible. And there's a lot of really positive developments. Just for example, last week, the State Land Board approved the ARCO wind and solar lease. Briefly, there are state endowment lands that revenue goes to fund schools. Previously, grazing and agriculture, the state received something like 59 cents per acre. For this wind and solar project near ARCO, they're going to get somewhere between $200 and $300 per acre. And that is going to increase total state endowment land revenue by like 25%.
Wow.
And can you believe that the state of Idaho is doing something positive for renewables? And that's because renewable energy just makes economic sense now. Even the State Land Board approved a renewable energy leasing policy that's going to bring more renewables to the state, and it's going to increase dollars for public schools, which we are in desperate need of. So this is a serious win-win.
You're clearly lying. I don't believe you at all. I'm going to need to see the facts sheet here.
I'll tell you, there is, I think earlier today, there was a report from KTVB, and I think it's titled, Idaho Approves First Solar Permit on State Endowment Land.
Oh, amazing. That's fantastic news. I had no idea, actually.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I'm so grateful to talk to you. This is amazing. It was such a treat to talk to Mitch. It was such a treat to talk to you. I'm just Idaho Conservation League, man. Look these guys up. Seriously, doing some wonderful, wonderful work. I wish I wish we had, a couple of your offices closer to the top here, up north, or something like you guys, a little more like you guys.
Well, we have an office in Sandpoint, an office in McCall,
yes,
an office in Ketchum, and Boise. So
excellent.
You're almost too far for Sandpoint or McCall.
Sandpoint is a lovely little trip. I'll have to make my way up there at some point.
There are some really fascinating water quality issues happening with the North Idaho lakes. We have the reason why we have an office in Sandpoint is because we have a North Idaho Lakes water quality program where we are focusing much more on wastewater treatment plants because those lakes are becoming a little bit more polluted from, old silver mines that were once in the state, that we're still addressing the, pollution from that era in Lake Pend Oreille. So that's a whole other program that we have that we didn't even mention.
Oh my gosh. A disservice to you is what I'm doing. Yeah. Well, Adrian, thank you so much again. Until next time, this has been fantastic. Thank you again.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks, Jet.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening, guys. Check out the Idaho Conservation League, please, at idahoconservation.org. I am begging you. Check the show notes for more information. This is such a cool group. They are doing incredible work in the state of Idaho. They are largely based in the southern part of the state, but as you heard Adrian mention, they are in the north part of the state as well, like in Sandpoint. There's areas in McCall. Remember, also, to mark your calendars for the upcoming trash event on November 10th. It's going to be at 11 a.m. at Tubbs Hill. There's further details soon to come. Follow us on Instagram at Sustainable Culture Online. Almost messed that one up. For more info coming this week, you can always reach out at sustainableculture.online. That is the main website where you can reach out to me directly. You can ask questions, make requests, all that stuff you can do on there. Thank you once again, folks, for listening to the show. Please rate and review the show where it is applicable. If it's on Spotify or if it's on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or whatever it is, you can review it and you can rate it, and that will help with growing an audience. It is so appreciated. This has been Sustainable Culture. I have been Jet. We'll see you folks next time.